My name is Raz. I'm head of the Occupational Medicine in one of the agencies that take care of patients, the provider of health in Israel. I also deal a little bit with medical ethics. And the nano thing about occupational medicine, about occupational health, about occupational hygiene is a field where you have many questions but very few articles of proven data. And therefore what I will try to do, not too long, is to explain what we know, what we don't know, why don't we know what we don't know, and what can we do about it in a practical way of behaving. First of all, producing nanoparticles started with Moore's law. It started a little bit earlier with Richard Feynman just after the Second World War, which said there is a lot of things to find down there. But then the Moore law, which most of you probably know, is that you have to put as many transistors as you thought, but double the number for every given space of chip. And you should double it first every year, then from 75 you should double it every 2 years, and it goes on. And it went smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, as you know, not everywhere it works like that. There are some places that transistors are still quite big, but the production of nanoparticles went on and on. Now, I will not give too many details about what you already know, which is, what is the meaning of the nano size, but there is a very important point of view, and we are going to end up with the popular concept of the nanoparticles, what everybody thinks of the nano thing. And the nano thing is most that everybody could tell about it. The name comes from Greek, and it's smaller than anything that you could think of. And of course, when you go very small, you face very many unexpected difficulties. Like this example, for example.
Just the same as real fruit. Clear fruitaceae. Well, almost.
Okay, so when you go small, you'll have to expect the unexpected. What changes in the nanoscale? If you know everything that I talk about, you can tell me just go on, because there is much to go on through. First of all, and probably the most important, the surface changes, especially the ratio of surface to mass. And it means a lot of things, because the material's reactivity, the chemistry is done on the surface. If you have more surface, things start behaving in a very different way from expected. You have the strength of materials that are becoming stronger than others, so you can't break them in any other way. You have the conductivity that changes, you have the flexibility that changes, you have color or transparency, both changes, so it is very difficult to identify some of those things. Solubility changes. Some materials that were relatively insoluble became very soluble, and the opposite, which means a lot of things on the way they behave inside the body. You cannot expect the pathophysiology to be the same. You cannot expect the mechanism of transportation and of excretion to be the same like they were before. Toxicity is the big question, and it probably also changes. The problem is that we don't know how, and we don't know how much. And the main reason for that is double. First of all, nobody pays us to learn. The funds that are there to see the toxicity of nanotechnology, they are not really funded. The industry doesn't want to know too much. They're afraid of the results. And governmental organizations, they're also not running from the other way to find more data. So there is not much research done. And if you would look at the PubMed, for example, about researches that are done about occupational health aspects of nanotechnology, from the last 10 years, you'll find about 3 dozens. That's it. Half of them reviews. So there is not much research done, and you'll see that from the dates of the articles, of the reviews that I'm going to review now. Evaluation methods, they are not good either. We have what we have, which is usually for fine particles, which are in the microscale and not in the nanoscale, and you just try to stretch it a little bit to the nano. It works until the size of 100 nanometers, but below that is still questionable. We don't know exactly. And of course, the control methods. You have control methods for the fine and ultra-fine range. For the nanoscale, not so much. You use what you have, and now it depends who you are. If you are from the part of the industry, you say that it works enough even for the nano. You don't bother to prove it. If you are from the side of the researchers, you say it doesn't work, but you can't prove it either. So from both sides, it's more the questions than other things. Why is that? We know that after below 50 nanometers, the classical physics rarely apply, and all the methods that we use also, for both sides of evaluation and for control. They are based on classical physics, and they do not apply in those sizes. You have the quantum physics that applies. Of course, we don't know what to do with those things. We don't have many techniques. We have many theories, which is wonderful. Some of them contradictory. All of them technically do not lead to results that could be used at hand. There is no such a respirator that you could buy and put in your lab that is planned especially for that, because nobody planned such a thing to date. Now, the most important question, as I said, is can safe material that you know from the large scale, from the micro scale, from the fine scale, and if you take it down to the nanoscale, is it still safe? Can you use all the data that you have until there, or could it turn toxic, and it means that all the rules are changing? And this is a very important question to which we have we have beginning of answers, but not real answers to date. You have all sort of regulatory bodies that have to put a lot of effort into that. Most of them do. The problem is that the number of grants is small, and therefore the effort is relatively small. And the way to find out is difficult because we are expecting a very, very long latency period for most of the expected diseases. Now, it goes on for a lot of industries, for a lot of the problems that we have in occupational medicine. The latent period could last 20 years, 30 years. Not one researcher will start the study and live on to see the results. And because people are working by the theory of publish or perish, most of them don't start meddling in this field. What they do is they use the current data and try to stretch it. Now, unfortunately, but it is good for everything in science, until you would see a clear proof of occupational illness, which is appearing in large scale, which will start taking the people's interest into that field, it will probably not happen. And you see that, let's say that the nano industry is growing very rapidly, at least in the last decade, and if you stretch it in the last 2 decades, very little research is done. You have many people saying what they think. Very few people can prove it. Okay, now, what are the human and environment interactions? First of all, we know that those particles are extremely mobile. We know that particles that are smaller than 200 nanometers, which is the mass majority of engineered nanoparticles, they can penetrate any cell. What do they do there? That's a good question. We don't really know, but we know that they can get in. Can they get out? Well, probably, but not necessarily. Is a penetration of circulation through lungs? Lungs are made for things to penetrate, and they do it very well through that. We even have some nice models trying to, let's say, foresee when will you have a problem if you have interaction of nanoparticles with lungs. And the nicest model that I found is discussing how much from the lung you have to cover in order to get a nice inflammation or significant inflammation. And for the time being, we're talking about 200 square centimeters, which is not much of the lung. If it is covered, you will have an inflammation. Will that inflammation lead to fibrosing disease? Well, that's what we fear, but we still don't know. Would that lead to cancer? Might be, but we have to wait for 20 years. So we are still waiting. If you swallow it, it could go through the GI tract, probably into lower amounts, but it means if you are talking about deliberate exposure or lab exposure. But if you cannot dispose of those particles and they go on to the water that you drink, then the GI thing becomes very important, especially for the general population. Can it happen? It surely can happen. Does it happen? We don't really know. Does it have a significance? That's a good question. Why? Because we know that you have natural nanoparticles, such as the diesel exhaustion gases, and people are exposed to that in very, very high levels for decades already. Do we see any specific illness that could be related to that? Not really. What does it mean? We are not sure. Some people say, the industry says that you could take a lesson from that and see that it really has no real importance. That's one possibility. Another possibility would be that we just didn't ask the right question, and therefore we didn't get the right answer. Then you say, okay, so we do not work with nanoparticles in the air because we don't want it to become an aerosol. We're going to work on that in liquid. That's nice. But then if you work in liquid, you have the dermal penetration, which could also be important. How much is it important? That's a good question. one of the first industries that used nanoparticles was the dermatology industry, especially when you talk about sunscreens. Most sunscreens use nanoparticles of titanium oxide and of other materials. Now we know from lab studies that it could create DNA damage, but still, all of us say use those sunscreen when you are exposed to sun. What does it mean? Do they ignore it? Well, they probably do, because they see that the damage in that is probably smaller than the damage of being exposed to the sun. How much was it quantified? Was it quantified for long exposures? That's a very good question. We don't have a clear-cut answer for that, but you have the industry. Okay, we have a direct penetration of the central nervous system through the olfactory mucosa. Is that important? Well, for fish it is. For human beings, it is also a possibility. What is the importance of that is still unknown. I know that the numbers of particles is relatively small, but the problem is that once they get inside the central nervous system, they can't leave. They are locked inside. What does it mean? Would they cause all kind of neurodegenerative diseases that we are afraid of? That's a possibility in a procedure which is very close to Alzheimer's disease. But then, how could you differentiate the nano-Alzheimer's disease from the general Alzheimer's disease, which is far more prevalent? That's still a good question, and we really don't know how to do it, and nobody is going to take brain biopsies to find out about it, I promise you that. Just to have a nice example of how can things go into the environment.
Love is in the air. Everywhere I look around, love is in the air. Every sight and every sound. And I don't know if I've been foolish, don't know if I've been wise, but it's something that I must believe in, and it's there when I look in your eyes. Love is in the air, in the whisper of trees.
Might be a nice joke, but that's what everybody is fearing now. What are the pathophysiological mechanisms? Coated particles could cause local chemical and inflammatory reaction. This thing we know. We know that the alveolar macrophages are trying to attack those particles, and the attack means inflammation, and when we are exposed to nanoparticles, we have a loss of the local pulmonary immune defense. Now we know from occupational classical diseases such as silicosis that when you're exposed to silica and the local macrophages try to attack the silica particles, then you're far more exposed to diseases such as tuberculosis, because you lose the population of your pulmonary macrophages. Is that going to be the same with nanoparticles? It is still a possibility. Lucky us that most of the researchers in the nano field don't have tuberculosis. But would it be a good question if the workers to be, if you make a pre-employment evaluation, should you rule out workers that have latent TB or something like that? That's still a good question. We don't have any markers of disease, but it's something to consider in the future. We know that following the blood-brain barrier, particles might remain inside the central nervous system, and then neurodegenerative diseases may appear. But they may appear 20 or 30 years later. Most people start their research when they're at their 30s. If you add, it means that the procedure will start at the 60s, which is sometimes a normal age for the beginning of neurodegenerative diseases. Could we ever differentiate that from the normal diseases? That's still a good question, and we're not sure that we are going to find out about that. We know about soluble particles. What happens with non-soluble particles? Again, solubility is nothing that you could predict from the macro scale. Now, you take the non-soluble particles, and we know that even when they are chemically harmless, they could just settle themselves in different places and create damage that we can very hardly foresee. One of the few procedures in which they can do it is the free radical damage. Another is oxidative stress. Both things happen. What is the meaning of that? That's a very good question. I know, and we know, that those particles can go through placenta. They can be theoretically teratogenic. Well, we don't know for sure. We had never heard of reports about teratogenic damages that are directly related to nanoparticles. We know that it's technically possible, but what is the meaning of that is still unclear, and about the scavenging mechanisms of the pregnant mother of the fetus, we also don't know. So it remains as an open question. We don't have enough population of that to see. We know that some coated particles, and the coating process made it very important that they cannot be tagged and they do not have any chemical relationship or very little chemical relationship with the environment. So on one hand, it's good. It means that there is no chemical activity of those particles. But from the other hand, it means that when it goes inside the reticuloendothelial system of the cells and it has to be marked by the ubiquitin system to be removed from the cell, it cannot be done. So once they're inside the cell, they're probably stuck in. What is the meaning of that? Would it lead to apoptosis? Probably yes, but to what extent? We don't really know. Another open question. We don't know which is the excretion mechanism. The levels of excretion should be lower than levels of exposure, which are low to begin with. So it's very difficult to find out. We don't know enough about that. And of course, all those stable particles, they go into the chemical industry of our body, they go inside the liver, and they probably stay there. They probably are going to create chronic hepatocellular damage in many mechanisms. Is it going to be significant? In the short run, probably not. In the long run, might be. We actually don't really know. So let's talk about what happens when it is in the air. Nice article from 2008. Describes that if you want to evaluate the nanoparticle aerosols in the working place, first of all, you should not consider the primary form of those nanoparticles to be the one that reacts with the body. Why so? Because you have many chemical processes, some of them of agglomeration, some of them of chemical changes. They just group with local aerosols that are found in the vicinity of the room, and others with themselves because of the humidity in the air, and they become much bigger. So one could say, okay, if it becomes much bigger, then there is no real problem, because once they're bigger, then it's not nanoscale anymore. It's microscale. This one we know. Well, the joy of the industry was too early, because although those particles agglomerate, they still have a surface, chemical surface, which is much bigger than the fine scale, and therefore, even though the general size of the particle is bigger, the chemical reactivity still belongs to the nanoscale, and the damage, or at least the possible damage, is still much bigger. Now, if you have a lot of aerosol, it will have more reaction. Less aerosol, less reaction. Which is more dangerous? It is difficult to know because you cannot make any comparative studies, especially not in the same laboratory. You cannot change the humidity or change the levels of aerosol. They just want you to remove it. As we have no comparative data, it will be very difficult to say which has more influence, and even more, where do you have more exposure? We don't know it. We can guess, and we do guess, but it depends on whom you ask. Many people guess many other things. Another work, which is discussing the exposure to engineered nanoparticles in working place, is estimated that all other exposures like diesel engine, kilns, electric motors, and oil mist should be taken into consideration, again, for this, the procedures of the change inside the aerosol ambience of those nanoparticles. And what was a surprise for the researcher and for us as well is that if you would increase the particle number concentration, you could not find out that the amount of aerosol in the air was also changing very significantly, because if you do the handling properly, then you can do properly whatever you want, and you will not be exposed more to those particles. Now, it means something very positive if you think about it, because what probably turns out, and we can understand from that, is that if you do good procedures of control of aerosol exposure, then you can do whatever you want. The problem is that we don't really know if we can check it properly. Only thing that we know is that the very same particles that we are closing in closed procedures, you cannot find them out. What about other particles, the bigger particles? Well, we did not evaluate that because we were not looking for them. So still it is in a question. We know that if you took the particle number concentrations, which is you just take the number of the particles in a given sample of air, then the microside nanoparticle agglomeration were underestimated. So you have less of the particles, the original particles, and you have more of the agglomerates. Are the agglomerates as dangerous as the original particles? We hope that they are a little bit less dangerous, but we cannot tell that for sure. Which work procedure tend to be more dangerous for that exposures? We are talking about cleaning, about maintenance work, about failure of the normal operation or opening closed system to take a sample. All those procedures that are unusual or that should be unusual, they really present a risk of higher exposure. You cannot avoid most of them, but you should pay more attention to the procedure while doing them, especially when we're talking about using personal protection gear. Another very important study is discussing the difference between the exposure values that we get by measurements in the laboratory and those that you get from completely simulations on laboratory conditions. Now, the results are not the same. It means that the models might not be as good as we thought, and it might be that one part is a little bit exaggerating or the other is diminuting the possible danger. What we think is the right way is, first of all, to take care of the real studies, the ones that were done in the laboratory environment, and only as a complementary data to use the system of simulation in laboratory conditions, because we have to take care of the real data. The problem is that in most laboratories, they don't do those studies because those studies are very expensive, and not all laboratories know how to do them. The equipment is now becoming more available, but still not everybody knows how to use it, and it's still quite expensive. The good advice that I could give on that step is that have at least one study by a good hygienist that deals with the nanofield in your laboratory, so you have at least one point of data to know what's going on in your laboratory. And most important thing, don't cheat yourself. In what way don't cheat yourself? Don't invite him in a day where you don't really work or where the exposure is supposed to be low. Invite him in the worst day of the year, because you want to know which is the highest possible exposure in your lab, and then everything else is much better. Not many people know how to do it, and not many people know how to draw the right conclusions from this data, but it should be done at least once, and it should be done properly. In most European countries, and I hope that I will hear that something changed, but as far as I know, there are no strict regulations about how should you do it and how often should you do it. Those regulations should come into action. It's a problem all over the world, by the way. It's a problem in Europe, it's a problem in the US, it's a problem everywhere. Those who do it because they think it's a good idea, not because they are regulated to do so. One of the problems that results from that is, as you have no regulation and as very few do it, you do not have a database. You cannot gather the data, and as you have no database, there is no future for this evaluation or regulatory evaluation procedure, because you will ever have more question marks than clear-cut results. That's a real problem. Okay. If you should calculate the amount of released nanoparticles, it should be a combination of the treatment process and of the employed materials. Many times, if you have a special technique in your laboratory, you cannot know what's going to happen with this combination unless you do it yourself, unless you do the evaluation in your own laboratory. Unlike other classical industries where you have very good models that you could foresee what's going to happen in a factory before you opened it, in here you have to do some of it yourself. We know that all powder handling procedures, they involve some nano-objects, and we know that in laboratory studies of workplace, it was not happening in procedures that are dealing with process of coatings and composites. What does it mean? It means that coating nanoparticles means that they do not appear in the air anymore? Or would it mean that the coating procedure might elucidate us, might interact in this way or the other with the mechanism of the samplers in a way that you cannot see those particles? That's a very good question, and many people fear that by creating more, or let's say, more advanced nanoparticles, the techniques that are going to be used to evaluate them will be less and less specific and less reliable. Metric is a very basic question that we see coming in all the literature. What is the metric that should be used for these procedures? Now, the classical metrics would be the mass metrics. You just evaluate the mass of those objects. It works well for the fine scale of particles, but here the mass concentration is just not good enough. You have to deal with the particle surface area, which is probably more correct when you deal with questions of chemical reactivity of lungs. That's a very nice theory, but still the instruments that do it, they are not very abundant, and we don't have any regulations about levels which are accepted for 8 hours working days, for short-term exposure limits, etc., etc. We don't have any good limits for that. So you have a result, and what can you do with it? You should think, what does it mean? But you cannot know what it means. We don't have the data for that yet. And of course, very important to have harmonization and standardization. Every laboratory has its own studies. Every producer of the machinery that is used to sample the air is using its own terminology. They do not want to work in a similar terminology because it will reduce their sales. They say, we do it in the better way. The result is that even if you want to pool all the results that you have to date from the industry, you can pool them by producer of instrument and not by industry type. And therefore, if you have no standardization and no harmonization, you cannot do any meta-analysis, not to describe the exposure, not to describe the relationship with illness, not to describe the prognosis. So it's further fractionizes the very limited data that we have to date. That's very difficult. If we're talking about particle number concentration and particle number size distribution, which is the commonly used metrics, this is something that we will go on using in the foreseeable future because this is most of the equipment that can be used in those laboratories. Usually, we think that the high sensitivity to the metric of airborne nanoparticles is not good enough, and we'll have to see that we'll move a little bit forward to the surface technology, and using the surface technology will probably be the future in that. And the more abundant we'll have the machinery that is meant for that purpose, we'll be able to enjoy it more and probably to have more reliable results to see if we can have higher levels of exposure and what is the meaning of that. So, to conclude, one of the last articles in the field, what are the main data gaps? We don't have any exposure metrics. We have very few dependable exposure scenarios that we can relate to. We don't have affordable monitoring technologies. And when we're talking about affordable, those that are done are usually very rare and very, very expensive. The exposure data and models are still very preliminary and less proven, even industry-wise. And we know that the data on the translocation and toxicity of nanomaterials is still mainly lacking. It's mainly stretching what we know from the fine-sized particles into the nano-sized particle, not much more than that. Of course, the associated testing strategies are not developed in a proper way, at least not in the standard that we know from the fine-sized particles. And all those missing gaps means that we cannot really offer good answer to those that really want to know what's going on with their industries. Of course, if you put in the uncertainty in both hazard and exposure assessment is likely to vary with the nature of the nanoparticle itself, and of course the degree of functionalization, which is derived from the covering, if it exists or if it does not exist. So everything that you have here is doubled or tripled by the processes that you go on with those nanoparticles. So eventually what you have is many fears and less data. Where do we go from there? I don't know if you are familiar with the field of occupational medicine. We finished with the boring hygiene part, I hope. Has anybody heard of the field of occupational medicine? Okay, so let's do it in a nutshell. In the occupational medicine field, what you should do is, first of all, see if workers can do what they're meant to do. And you do it by two mechanisms. First of all is the pre-employment evaluation. You have a worker that wants to go to work in this industry or in this job or the other, and you try to find out if it is proper, if it is a good idea that he will start working in that industry. For example, if somebody wants to work as a teacher and he has a problem in his vocal cords, it is going to be a very bad idea for him to become a teacher because he's probably going to exhaust his vocal cords even if they are normal. So probably that would be a good idea that he will take another track in his life and not become a teacher. That's one example. If you are going to work in the chemical industry and you have a lot of problems with your hepatic system, you have, let's say, chronic hepatitis or something like that, then your liver has its own endogenous problems, and probably it's going to be a bad idea to expose you to more things that could create damage to that system. So this is the pre-employment evaluation. In the nanotechnology, it's going to be very difficult to find those things. I gave the idea of tuberculosis. There might be others, but still it is not well established. Then you have the other side of the spectrum, which is the workability spectrum. The workability spectrum means the one that is already working in that industry and his health changed, usually, and unfortunately, his health deteriorated. And then the question is, can he go on working on that? Now, that's a very good question, because people on one hand, they don't want their health to be harmed, but on the other way, they don't want to lose their job, they don't want to lose their salary, they don't want to lose what they're working for their entire lives. So you have to balance between their health and between the work needs and try to find some good solution in the middle. Again, we don't have many cases of clear-cut diseases that could be related to the nanotechnology exposure, and therefore the workability questions tend to be more generalized and not industry specific. Then, of course, you have the things of the periodic health examination. The periodic health examination that are done in the traditional industry. If you work with noise, then you will do hearing tests every now and then, usually a yearly hearing test, to see if the noise created some damage. If you work with all kinds of metal, all kinds of solvents, you'll try to find what are the problems that are caused by those things, and you try to do a primary prevention. You'll try to find which test to do in order to avoid the appearing of such diseases. This is something very nice, but then you cannot still tell which diseases are expected to come from the nano industry exposures, and therefore to do those tests will be very presumptuous in that field. You have questions about criteria for causation that we are going to discuss in 1 minute, and then you will have also problems that are general in the occupational medicine field but could be related specifically to what we deal now with the nanotechnology. First of all, you have the healthy worker effect. The healthy worker effect says that if you have an industry in which you can find exposures that might have a significant effect on people's health, then those that suffer from them, you will not find them in the industry. For example, if you'll go into, for example, a flour mill, you don't find any people that are suffering from bronchial asthma in there, because the flour dust is being so irritative to them that after a few days of work, they will not feel well and they will go home. So whenever you go there, you will never find any bronchial asthma patients, and you will conclude for that the exposure means nothing, because you have the healthy worker effect. It might be here, although we probably don't know it yet, but then you cannot ignore the fact that if you don't find any patients, it doesn't mean that the exposure is harmless. On the other way, you have the canary in the coal mine. Do you know the story of the canary in the coal mines? The canaries were more sensitive than the coal miners, and therefore if you had gases like methane or carbon monoxide, they would die first. And then it it would be time for the coal miners to run away quickly before there will be an explosion or before they will be suffocated themselves. The problem is that many times you have one worker that says, I have a problem. Nobody else has. And as an occupational physician, you look at him and say, he must have a problem, but it must be here, not in his body, because everybody are just fine. He is complaining and complaining. Now, in most cases, the problem is not occupational. But in some cases, he is the human canary bird. Some people are just more sensitive, and if you evaluate this test case, you will get to a more important results. So you cannot ignore even one report. The question will be how to evaluate the relationship. So, what are the criteria for causativity? Everybody knows the Bradford Hill criteria. We're not going to go over them deeply, but I think that every scientist should know those criteria. They were developed by Sir Austin Bradford Hill in the early 60s. And what they say is that you have several criteria for causativity between exposure and disease. You're talking about strength, which means that there will be the large association. It means that the causativity makes more sense. It has to be consistent in many studies. It has to be specific to a certain exposure and to a certain malady. It has to be of normal temporal range, which means you have to have the exposure first and the disease later, which doesn't always work. And of course, you need to have the latency period in between. You cannot expect that a person that was exposed to I don't know what and will have cancer in 6 months, that it will have any relation with that exposure because the latency period is just not long enough. Then you need to have the biological gradient, which means more biological effect, more disease, and not vice versa. It has to have some plausibility with mechanism. Now, we don't know everything yet, but we managed to describe vast majority of the mechanisms of biological tissues to all kinds of exposures. So if you think about a new things, it should have at least a similarity, it should be parallel, at least in a way, to something that you already know. And if you have no plausibility, that's a real problem. It might be that you just discovered something big, something new in biology, but it should be really, really rare that it acts like that. Then, of course, coherence between epidemiological and laboratory findings, although if you find the laboratory to be all right and only epidemiological studies show the effect, you cannot completely rule it out because probably, or it is a possibility that you don't have the laboratory setup to do those things. And of course, we have the thing of experiment. This is the classical criteria by Koch. You need to have an experiment. Today we are not as strict because sometimes you cannot do a real experiment, and I do not expect that many nanotechnology workers will agree to participate in such an experiment, but still, technically, it's one thing that is important to do. And of course, analogy. Analogy to other diseases, to other mechanisms. Here again, the analogy might be weaker because we just said that chemically you cannot make such an analogy so quickly because the physics doesn't apply, the quantum mechanics applies instead. Maybe the analogy will going to be weaker in those cases. So, if we look at consideration about occupational medical surveillance, what should you do with the worker? As we said, we have no accepted exposure metric, and we have a lot of possibilities. What things that should be taken into consideration is the particle number, which we know, the total particle surface, which is probably more important, the particle type, including geometry. Why is the geometry so important? Mainly because of the behavior in the lungs. If we are talking about elongated shapes of particles, they might stick into the lungs like asbestos, and then you can't get rid of them, and the inflammatory reaction is going to be much stronger. And of course, chemical composition and meaningful contaminants. You probably know that if you deal with asbestos, for example, the more dangerous asbestos is the one that has the higher content of iron. Why so? Because it induces much more inflammatory reaction. Would it be correct also for the nanoparticles? I suppose so. It might be so, but we don't know it for sure, and this is something that should be taken into consideration. Now, we know that as we have no standards and no uniformly applied measurement methods, and we cannot compare between the studies, so we can't get a lot of sense of the data that we have till now. And we know that biomonitoring methods, which is the next step, which till now we talked about the exposure, which is what the hygienists do. Now we talk about the toxicologist. What are the monitoring methods? We don't have any of those methods that is ratified and could be used for now. We have many thoughts of that, but nothing that was done in a large scale. And if we try to take advantage of methods that were applied in animal experiments, like radio labeling, like magnetic tagging, it's not a possibility with human beings. No Helsinki committee, and for a reason, will allow those things to do. So we can return to the very basic, to do some serum studies about the levels of the materials, about the level of chemicals that you see in the nanoparticles, to see how much you can find in the blood system, to see if there is enough internal exposure. That's a nice idea. The problem is that it probably will not be sensitive enough. Why will it not be sensitive enough? Because those systems are meant to describe findings in the atomic level and not in the particle level. It probably could create a very significant underestimation of the results. It cannot be trusted as we see. So, what is the offer of Nasterlak? It's a very nice offer. He said, okay, so let's try to take an industry that we know well, that might be close to that, and try to draw conclusions on a field that we have quite a long history of looking at those patients. And he thought that the best example might be the welding industry, which is being followed for at least 50 years, and we know a lot about their behavior in the field. So what do they say about welding processes? First of all, you could say that it has some kind of parallelism to the nanoparticles because there are high numbers of partly ionized, partly oxidized, and sometimes highly reactive metallic particles in the nanoscale, along with irritant and toxic gases like ozone that goes together and make some other damages. And then what did you find in those that were doing welding for very long periods? First of all, you've seen decrements in lung functions in most of them. Why so? Mainly due to fibrosing lung disease. Infrequent cases of interstitial fibrosis that were usually related to local ventilation that was not good in the working place. And of course, if you look at what we really fear of, which is the central nervous system and reproductive finding, most of them were absent or inconsistent. They didn't find any clear-cut relation. And if you talk about cancer, which again everybody fears, then the relationship was not found to be clear-cut. And the IARC, the agency that is trying to examine thoroughly and to do meta-analysis about all kinds of exposures and materials to decide whether they are carcinogenic or not, they decided already in the 90s that welding fumes are only possibly carcinogenic, means that there is very, very little evidence for that assumption. And therefore, what Nasterlak said about 7 years ago is that we probably should define the nanoparticles as possibly carcinogenic, and the damage probably is less than we would expect. What are the arguments pro and contra medical surveillance for those that work in the industry? So we are using the criteria that were referenced by Borak a year earlier in 2006. First of all, the burden of suffering. Is there a burden of suffering in the nanotechnology industry? I suppose not. The accuracy and reliability of the examination methods, as you just have heard, the accuracy is not significant and the reliability is even smaller. So this doesn't apply as well. The effectiveness of early detection means the way that early detection would avoid the development of disease. Again, you don't have much of that. What are the harms of screening? Well, not much. But what you could do is, if you would screen for those diseases, if you don't look for the right things, and if you ask, we used to say that if you ask often enough the silly questions, you will get silly answers. What are you going to do with those silly answers? Some people that could go on working in the industry might be removed from the work without any good proof for doing so, and that's a real problem. Does the benefit outweigh the harm? I'm not sure. Nobody else does. And then taking together, he said there is no basis for targeted nanospecific occupational medical surveillance. Now, this is the easy way out. According to the data, which is only partially existent, this probably is correct. The question is if this should be re-evaluated. And the answer is probably yes. It should be re-evaluated when we'll have more data and when time advances, so we have more reliable things to do with it. Talking about control, how you control those exposures. The critical assumption is that nanoparticles that become airborne will follow the laws of aerosol physics and the classical rheology fluid dynamics. This is the general assumptions. Why do we use this assumption? First of all, because we have no better at the moment. If we're talking about the scientific studies on the aerosol behavior of nanoparticles, they see that they follow these established laws, so at least from the physical way of thinking, we have something to cling to, which is not to be taken lightheadedly. Usually, the particles will follow the surrounding airflow, which is very good, because it means that if you are afraid of the particles that you work with, if you work in a positive pressure systems, it means that you will be probably immune from exposure and from any influence of those materials. Those systems of positive pressure, they are not very easy to use and they are quite expensive, but probably it provides very positive answer for those who say, we are afraid of that. This is one thing that probably could be done. Another thing, you could collect those particles with filter elements. Why is it important? There are some theories, like the thermal bouncing, that say that according to the quantum mechanics, if you pass some of those particles through a filter, it might bounce through the filter. And it means that if you recycle the air in the laboratory, it means that it could return back to you after the filter. And if you use the filter for exhaust system, it might have problems with the environment. Now, theoretically, this is possible. Again, proof is not really existent. It remains a matter of concern from those dealing with those fields. What we do say is that if we are discussing the HEPA, the high efficiency particular air filters, they probably are good at least to begin with. So if we are dealing with HEPA filters, especially for the environmental causes, especially for clearing the air of the laboratory before you use the exhaust system out, it probably supplies some supplies a good technology to get rid of most of the particles, if not the vast majority of them. In a study that was done about N95 filtering phase pieces, the most penetrating particle size was near 40 nanometers. Why is it good to know? First of all, because most of you know what is the size of the nanoparticles that you are using. It means that a technology that is available at the moment, if you have particles that are smaller or much bigger than 40 nanometers, then it is probably very good. In the field of 40 nanometers, not as good. Still, we don't have any other alternative, but it is for those who use it to know. Now, under the aggressive laboratory test condition that were employed in this study of the NIOSH, of the American institution, of which Schulte, the writer, is probably the scientific leader, they found that the mean penetration for 40 nanometer particles ranged from 1% to 5%, even in the worst case scenario, which means that even in the worst case, you can be sure that more than 95% of the particles are out. This is something that was calming for many people that had no idea if the HEPA system actually works in those things. Now, of course, you need a lot of more study to be done about effectiveness of filter media, about the extent of leakage inside and outside. Very good questions that are being evaluated at the moment. By the way, you have more research on that because here you have industry that pays for that research and you have grants for that. They want to see whether those filters are active, whether they're good enough. Engineering controls are recommended before the use of work practices. For example, the personal protective equipment, the respiratory protective equipment, the hand protective equipment for those that are working in the liquid phase. All of them should be used. First of all, because of the general precautionary principle, and there because we know that there is some effect of those systems and there is no reason not to use them. If we're talking about engineering controls, of course, containment of the process is the best thing. If you do the process in a closed system, then it could actually be irrelevant for the workers nearby. That's probably the best thing to do. To isolate the worker is a possibility, but the possibility is not as good in here. And of course, you need ventilation system to remove the hazardous substance, something that is even less efficient, but again, more feasible. And of course, to do some changes in the process, especially when it includes working with powders or possible aerosolization processes that should be avoided. Then, after using the engineering control, which are the more efficient, you go to the administrative controls. For example, make sure that it is not going to be the same worker doing that work all the time, making sure that the worker is not there when he should not be there, etc., etc. So you limit 10 minutes.
3.
Oh, I need more. Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, very well. So if we want to reconcile the scientific evidence, the ethical aspects, and the legal requirements, risks are uncertain and the decision-making process is not completely supported by the degree of evidence, and then we have a lot of ethical dilemmas. First of all, is the available evidence on nanoparticle risks sufficient to undertake all the medical examination? For the time being, the answer is probably negative, but only probably. Is it sufficient to support medical decisions? To date, in a very limited way. What is the minimum level of evidence which is required to make a decision? This is something that might change because you don't have, it's not that you ignore some of the data that you have, you just say, I don't have any data, I should take decision according to the data that I have at the moment. If you're talking about the basic principles that are going to known as the Georgetown Mantra, which Dr. Sigal is going to say more in the second part of the day, the beneficence or non-malfeasance to do the good and not to be the bad. You should not block all research, you cannot block all study because of the fear of the future, but you should make sure that you do not harm workers in the procedure, especially by making them go through medical examinations that are unnecessary and taking the decisions that have no influence on the future. Of course, you should make sure that when you make a worker pass those examinations, you have the problems that some of the examination make him feel, okay, I'm free of disease, I'm fine with those examinations, I can do whatever I think, which is incorrect. And on the other hand, if you have bad results that have less meaning, he could be afraid that I'm going to die because of that exposure, although it has nothing to do with things that he was really exposed to. Of course, the autonomy principle, people should make decisions about their own life. How can they do it? Here, the autonomy can be violated in a very, very significant way because medical examinations, they have a lot of ethical cost. You do it in a mandatory way, and it could change the way people make decisions about their own life. And of course, the justice principle, it should be a matter of everybody, all the population, and here you are very strict only with the workers in the laboratory, although others might be exposed to diesel particles in a way which is even more important. Last question is the question of public anxiety. We know that people are afraid. Why are people afraid? People are afraid because they don't know what's the meaning of the nano thing, and everything that is related to nanotechnology is related to public fear. Now, there are a lot of books about it, a lot of things that you might have heard, that expression of fear. What's going to happen to the mankind? Will they take over us? And we know that there are many factors that lead to public feeling of fearness. One of them, those are things that you cannot see, you cannot smell, they are not natural, they are man-made, so they must be worse. Some of them are things that could probably be more dangerous for children or for pregnant women, which is also a source of fear. The authorities, they don't have a clear-cut opinion of is it important or not important, what does it do to our health? All those questions are still in the air. We should deal in our decisions not only with the proper way of dealing with scientific questions, but we should be also aware of the public aspects of those decisions and the amount of fear that could be raised among the general population is also another consideration which is not entirely scientific, but still very important in the decision that we make. Thank you.